We know that 2020 so far has been
unprecedented.
Normally it's a campaign trail full of baby kissing, handshaking and crowd rallying. But with the pandemic gripping America, election year looks very different. A vicious virus, economic chaos and mass protests against systemic racism. So how will these crises affect the American vote? In a year of disorder, can we expect democracy to run smoothly? The US presidential election is due to take place on the 3rd of November 2020. The choice is clear: re-elect the incumbent Republican President Donald Trump or pick Democratic candidate and former Vice President Joe Biden. Campaign strategies have shifted as Covid-19 has spread. While President Trump has gone ahead with physical rallies, focusing his efforts on rebooting the economy after lockdown,
I saved hundreds of thousands of lives.
The Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, has largely turned to Zoom to stir up support.
Please welcome Vice President Joe Biden.
Hey, good evening, Tampa. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Historically, the incumbent president has the momentum when it comes to the campaign trail.
Presidents always have a built-in advantage in that they can make news instead of just respond to news.
But incumbency comes with its burdens too, especially when a global recession hits. Before the virus, President Trump's pitch to the American people was the strength of the US economy on his watch.
The markets have gone through the roof since November 9th. That's the day after I won the election. Whether you love me or hate me, you gotta vote for me.
But the devastating financial impact of Covid-19 means he's now unable to do that. Tens of millions of Americans filed for unemployment since the pandemic hit. At one point, that was a quarter of the workforce.
Even if Donald Trump never appeared in front of another camera, if he is going to be presiding over an economy that looks in 6 months like it does now, that is not going to be good for him, regardless of his tactics or his strategy.
And as a result, Trump has pushed for America to open up. His indoor rally in Tulsa went against public health advice, and the empty seats showed it. For a president where optics are everything, it appeared to be a real blow to the campaign.
President Trump is now the underdog.
In late June, Joe Biden had a 14-point lead over President Trump in the polls.
Growing majorities of Americans disapprove of how Trump is handling the pandemic and Black Lives Matter protests.
Black Lives Matter.
Here might lie another factor in America's vote choice come November. With Covid-19 disproportionately killing the black community and a viral video of George Floyd's death at the knee of a white police officer, mass protest forced urgent debate. The protests also shone a light on another big issue when it comes to the 2020 election: voter suppression.
There's a long history in this country of using voting rules to limit access to the ballot. So in the 1960s, a core part of the civil rights movement was to enfranchise African Americans against a set of rules that were designed to keep them from voting. And in the last decade in this country, we've seen some of those rules creep back in. So, for example, in a recent election in Georgia, there were people waiting for hours to vote.
Normally, I wait in line for like maybe an hour, maybe. This time, I've already been in line for 3 hours.
I do think that there is systematic disenfranchisement of specific communities.
One party, the Republican Party, dramatically limited the number of places people could vote. Those kinds of things are happening around the country. At the core of our democracy is this sort of celebration of being able to vote, but it's absolutely under threat.
And if the long lines aren't putting people off voting, then the pandemic might. In 1918, the US held a midterm election in the midst of the deadly Spanish flu outbreak and World War I. It was called the first masked election in history. Turnout was down as a result. Fast forward to 2020, and you see a striking resemblance to what's happening now. This is a primary election in Wisconsin in April, where citizens had to choose between a stay-at-home order or voting for their presidential candidate.
I'm just a stubborn, very patriotic person who wants to vote in person.
Many officials are keen to avoid the Wisconsin scenario, where voters were forced to choose between protecting their health because of COVID or not voting at all.
It's time to demand safe ways to vote this November. We have to raise our voices today.
so they can't be silenced tomorrow.
Some say there's an easy solution to this: voting by mail. Traditionally, in order to qualify for what's known as an absentee ballot, you had to provide an excuse as to why you couldn't go to the polling station on election day. Recent reforms have expanded absentee ballots in many states as a convenience option. The states you can see highlighted here are ones where you don't need an excuse to vote absentee. Vote by mail is slightly different from voting absentee, as it's the process of sending every registered voter a ballot without request. 5 states already do this as their default. President Trump says he doesn't have a problem with absentee ballots, but he has a big problem with vote by mail.
Do you think every state in this country should be prepared for mail-in voting?
No, because I think a lot of people cheat with mail-in voting.
Trump claims voting by mail encourages fraud, where one voter impersonates another or votes more than once. But there's no evidence that vote by mail and voter fraud are linked. Scattered examples of it are incredibly rare. The president's problem appears not to lie with the practicalities of vote by mail, but with the politics of it.
The conventional wisdom is Republican voters go vote, and Democratic voters don't always turn out. Allowing people to vote by mail, it should make the costs of voting pretty much go to zero, which if one side has a lot to gain from eliminating the costs of voting, it should benefit that side. But the data suggests that it doesn't advantage the Democrats over the Republicans.
In fact, if we go back to our map showing the 5 states that already use vote by mail for their elections, one of those states is Utah, which is heavily Republican.
The president is wrong when he says that under a vote-by-mail system, no Republicans could ever get elected. That's preposterous. One of my greatest fears is that we have a very close election, that there is a delay in counting the huge number of absentee ballots that are coming in, and that in that period of delay, if President Trump is ahead, he could try to claim that there's fraud with the remaining ballots and claim that he's the winner, even if Joe Biden is ultimately the winner of a particular state. And so that could get very ugly in a way that we have not seen even in our disputed 2000 election between Bush and Gore.
In Bush versus Gore, the Supreme Court ultimately had to decide who won the presidency. After an exceptionally tight race, a forced recount in Florida, which was then reversed, and weeks of legal wrangling, Republican George W. Bush was eventually declared the winner over Democrat Al Gore. It was, you guessed it, unprecedented. What's clear from elections gone by is that running a fair one can get messy pretty quickly, even without the risk of a global pandemic, and especially in a country as enormous and fragmented as the United States.
It's an unstated assumption in democracy that the losers believe that the election is legitimate and agree to fight another day. Something we've taken for granted for a very long time in the United States. But I don't know that we can continue to take it for granted.
The coronavirus, a recession and racial inequality may have defined the year 2020 so far, but some people are working hard to ensure a disputed election doesn't end it. After all, there's a lot at stake, both the health of the public and of democracy itself.